Good afternoon, good evening, and thank you so much for joining this Links conversation on COVID-19. My name is Karesha McGee. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm excited to serve as the moderator of this important discussion. On behalf of the Peninsula Bay chapter of the Links Incorporated Programming Committee, namely Links Kelly Jones, Shaw Alexander, Thelma Hicks, Benita Parker, Shanta Stewart, Tamara Sisk, Angela Alton, Mona Simpson, and Cecily Johnson, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our first webinar, Debunking the Myths of the COVID-19 Vaccine. Inspired by some of the recent informative COVID-19 webinars organized by our National Links organization, as well as ongoing conversations with friends and family, we have assembled a panel of 4 distinguished healthcare professionals who will offer their expertise on the vaccine. We've also been fortunate to partner with the Gamma Chi Boule of Sigma Pi Phi fraternity to pull this webinar together, and we're so grateful for the opportunity to share this timely information with you. Our hope is that coming away from this session, you'll have a better understanding of the full life cycle of the vaccine, namely around 4 key topics. First, how the vaccine was developed. Second, an overview of the clinical trials process. Third, the distribution and administration of the vaccine. In other words, how we get shots in arms, especially here in the Bay Area and in Northern California. And finally, specific information on the vaccine as it relates to women and pregnancy. What you should know if you are pregnant or planning to become pregnant, so you can make a more informed decision about your health and the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, before introducing our guest presenters, a little bit of background on the links, as well as a few housekeeping items. For those of you who are not familiar with the Peninsula Bay chapter of the Links, ours is a local chapter of the National Volunteer Service Organization with more than 16,000 talented and dedicated professional African-American women who believe we can make positive transformations in our communities. This webinar is a means of focusing our efforts on health education and wellness about COVID-19 and the disproportionate impact among the African-American community. A few other housekeeping items. So first, this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available afterwards. Second, all attendees will be muted during the presentation portion. However, we do encourage questions. We very much want this to be interactive. So thank you to those who've submitted questions as part of your registration. We have those on file. And for everyone else, feel free to submit questions in the chat and we'll address them during the Q&A. And now to introductions. I'm very pleased to introduce our 4 presenters. These executives have incredible backgrounds, and we could actually spend the entire session just hearing about all of the notable things they've accomplished. In the interest of time, I'm going to give you a quick snapshot of their bios, and you can find their more detailed background on our website, www.pblinks.org. So first, without further ado, please let me welcome Mr. Jim Knight, who was recently appointed Chief Business Officer of Synact Pharma and heads up their business development and pipeline portfolio management team. Prior to this, Mr. Knight was the VP of Portfolio Strategy at Questcor Pharmaceuticals, where he was responsible for leading the expansion of products through clinical trials. Prior to Questor, he was at Elan Pharmaceuticals, where he led a global strategic marketing team working closely with the collaborators on the successful development and commercialization of a monoclonal antibody. Mr. Knight has a BS in biology from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and an MBA from Northern University. Welcome, Mr. Knight. Next, very excited to welcome Dr. Owen Garrick, who is President and CEO of Bridge Clinical Research, a global clinical research and health communications firm focused on drug development, scientific advancement, and patient engagement. BCR is active in 5 therapeutic areas: anti-infectives, autoimmune, cardiovascular disease, endocrinology, and oncology. Dr. Garrick leads the clinical trials, research analytics, health services research, and healthcare communications business units. He also serves as an advisor to the Stanford Precision Health for Ethnic and Racial Equity Center, which is one of the 5 NIH centers focused on precision medical tools to improve the health of underserved ethnic groups and racial groups. Dr. Garrick earned an MD from the Yale School of Medicine, an MBA from Wharton, and an AB in psychology from Princeton. Welcome, Dr. Garrick. And now, also very excited to introduce Mr. Kenneth West, the Chief Operating Officer at Hospital Corporation of America's Regional Medical Center in San Jose, AKA Valley Medical Center. Mr. West has a wealth of industry knowledge in service line development and operations. Prior to regional, Mr. West served as Vice President, Chief Operating Officer, and Ethics and Client Compliance Officer at HCA's Medical Center of Trinity in Trinity, Florida. Prior to that, he was Associate Chief Operating Officer at Chippenham and Johnston Willis Medical Center in Richmond, Virginia. Mr. West has an MS in Health Sciences, Health Systems Administrations from Georgetown and a BS in Nutritional Sciences from Louisiana State University. Welcome. And last, but certainly not least, please welcome Dr. Nerese Kendrick. Dr. Nerese Kendrick is the founder and medical director of Women's Care for Life Medical Practice. She's a board-certified OBGYN who has practiced in San Jose for more than 10 years. Dr. Kendrick obtained a BS in biochemistry from Lehman College, where she graduated magna cum laude. She received her medical doctorate from Yale University Medical School. After completing her medical residency at Kaiser Permanente here in Oakland, she joined the San Jose Medical Group, and then a few years later, she became an established physician in private practice. Next, Dr. Kendrick went on to found her own dual private practice, Women's Care for Life, to individually serve both the OBGYN and aesthetic or anti-aging areas of service. Dr. Kendrick has appeared as a guest speaker on the Bay Area news station KRON 4, and she's the winner of 2 Reader's Choice Awards. Again, thank you so much for joining us, all of you. We're so excited to hear you. And now I would like to kick us off with our conversation. First, I'll turn it over to Jim Knight for his presentation. And before I actually scoot on, I just wanted to make sure what we've shared up on screen is some current state statistics regarding the current state of COVID-19, both COVID-19's cases that we've seen in California, as well as the loss of life in California. It's very important, and we'll hear additional information on these sorts of statistics in the furthering presentations, excuse me. And now, without further ado, let me kick it over to Dr. Jim Knight for his presentation. He'll talk to us a little bit about how the vaccine was developed and also debunk some of the myths about what's in the vaccine. Mr. Jim Knight, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be part of this link-sponsored event today. And before I get into the presentation, I just want to clear up one thing, and that is I've had my second COVID vaccine. I'm 77 years old. I had it 14 days ago, and I'm feeling no side effects. So I'm good to go. Just wanted to put that out there because I know a lot of people say when you talk about something, you ought to be about it. So yes, I've had the vaccine. I got the Moderna version and no side effects, and I'm feeling great. So thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing.
Okay, next slide. Now, one of the things that I hear a lot being in this field, and that is, who was involved in developing this vaccine? And was there any Blacks involved in it? And if so, what did they do? What were their roles? And, you know, all of the different kinds of questions. Well, I just wanted to, in this slide, let you know that there has been some really prominent Blacks involved in the development of the vaccine. And starting with the top left up there is Dr. Corbett. Now, she's been on television a lot, and I'm sure you must have seen her. She was the lead scientist in the development of what was now known as the Moderna vaccine. She's been on and featured in Dr. Fauci and whoever's name is. So I would think of all of the Black scientists that she's probably one of the most prominent out there right now in this area of developing COVID-19 vaccine. And then there's Dr. Suba. She's at the University of Pittsburgh, and she's really, I mean, I followed a lot of her publications and her work, and she's certainly one of the leading experts in the respiratory distress syndrome. So she's basically when people get on respirators and you know how to manage that part of it. She's a leading scientist in that area. And finally, Dr. Jordan, who is he's out in Arizona, and he's been involved in the development of science around the antibodies. So that's just an example of Blacks involved, and I just wanted to share that with you. This is certainly not the encompassing, but the one thing I will tell you is this: just and so you know it. The ratio of females to males, I hate to say it, but they're about 2 to 1 who are working in this whole area of science. So kudos to you, and I'm glad and congratulations for all the work you've done. Thank you. Moving on to the next slide. Now, uh, the next question that is out there in the minds of a lot of people, and one of the things and one of the myths that probably needs to be debunked or talked about a little bit is, was the vaccine developed too fast? And I'm not sure what too fast is, but I'm just want to walk back with you a little bit in history and say, when I look back in 50 or 60 years ago, I'm sorry, 60 plus years ago, there was something out there called the mumps. And I don't know if any of you were around during that time, but that vaccine took 4 years. During that same time period, the US decided they wanted to put a man on the moon. And that was a combination of scientific endeavors by a lot of people, but that mission took 10 years. And we successfully landed a man on the moon. The next important discovery was one that we're going to talk about today, and that is the mRNA vaccine, or the RNA vaccine, which is now out there and available commercially for us. And that took 6 months. And I would say, if I look back and could sort of share one thing with you, that was primarily due in part to advances made in genomic sequencing. And we'll talk about more about genomic sequencing. So my closing on this slide is, okay, if we can develop 60 years ago a mumps vaccine, which is basically some similar technology to what vaccines are done today, we could put a man on the moon in 10 years. Why is there a question about why it only took 6 months to develop an mRNA vaccine? And all I can say is, moving on, I don't know if all of you have heard this or seen it on television, but all I gotta say is, come on, man, because there's been a lot of advances been made in science, and that's just the way things happen. Due to advancements in science, we've able to put this vaccine out there in 6 months. Next slide. Now, let's talk about the development, discovery and development process. It starts out in a research laboratory. Moving from there, we go to preclinical trials, where we have this idea, a scientific idea that we want to test out. And we start out in laboratory, and then we move on to animal testing. And once that theory is proven out, then we move to the third phase, which is people testing. And this is where we deal with safety and efficacy of the vaccine that we are interested in. And here too, again, a lot of people say, well, who was involved in the safety and efficacy testing, and was it black? Well, yeah, I can tell you right now, there was probably, at least 20 to 30% of the people involved in the mRNA vaccines were from the black population, the ethnic groups of blacks. And then moving on to FDA review, and finally, after review and data examination, and then it's approved. And of course, there's monitoring and following up after the vaccine is out there and being administered. So that's kind of how the process works. Next slide. Now, the COVID-19 vaccine, as it was discovered, and obviously, I don't know if all of you follow this, but it was really discovered in 2019, and people were getting sick, and they were being brought into clinics. But the bottom line is, how do you find out what this is? How do you discover whether it's a virus versus a bacteria, some other pathological agent? One of the key techniques is high resolution microscopy, where you can take the individual components, which on the right-hand side is basically what the COVID vaccine looks like. And all I can say is those red spikes you see sticking out of it is basically the mechanisms or the vehicles that the vaccine uses to infect human beings once you're exposed to it. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but I just want to put this out there to say, starting out, you get people who are sick, you take a sample, you look at it, you examine it by different techniques, but eventually one of the most useful techniques is electron microscopy, and that's how what you see out there today on television and basically is depicted based on the size and structure of the molecule of the component itself. Next slide. Now, okay, once you are able to isolate the components of the virus itself, now it's well known in science that any organism, anything out there that's replicating itself or reproducing itself is probably based on some kind of genetic component inside of it. And inside of it means that the ability to reproduce and replicate yourself is based on a fundamental technique that we call based around genomics. And genomics is based on two components, DNA and RNA. And so what happened was, once they were able to isolate the coronavirus, then they were able to move inside of the contents of it and see that, yes, there is some products in there that basically has genomic structures. And that's where the scientists then said, now we can now use this information and go in and understand how it basically infects and replicates itself once the human being is infected. So it's based around genomics. Next slide. Okay, now let's back up again. So inside of the bacteria, the virus, or whatever we're talking about, and then in this case it is the virus, there's what we call the genomic material. And the genomic material is made up of a couple of components that I just want to sort of review with you here. One is RNA, which is ribonucleic acid, and it's used to translate instructions from the DNA to make proteins in the body, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But basically, the DNA is it's kind of like the blueprint of life. Anything that is replicating, reproducing out here in the world, it's basically, it starts out with the DNA. But the transcription part of it, and where it moves into making the protein of the next phase of it, is translation into what we call a protein on RNA, and that's the genetic material. Now, viruses, and pretty much every organism out there has this. Some viruses have DNA and RNA, some only have RNA. And then the protein, which is, these enzymes and hormones and antibodies that you must hear about. But that's basically how the body protects itself against foreign invasion. So this is basically kind of like what we call the dogma of life, or so to speak. It's DNA translates to RNA and eventually end up with proteins. Next slide. Now, I put this slide up here for a couple of reasons. Everyone out here has asked the question, we're going to get into it a little bit later, of what's in what I'm taking. How do I know what I'm taking? What's contained in what I'm taking? Now, I want to back up here and say most people may or may not have taken an antibiotic. Amoxicillin is a very common one. And all of these, this particular one has what we call the active ingredient, which is the amoxicillin as a trihydrate complex. And then there's the accompaniment products that make it up to make it stable, to get it color, and give it all the characteristics that it needs. But if you look at the active ingredients, there's about 9. And then if you look at the printing ink that's outside of the capsule itself, there's a whole bunch of things that, in the printing ink called shellacs and alcohol and so forth. But I don't know if when you go to the doctor and he says, I'm going to prescribe to you amoxicillin, how many people really sit down and take a look at, okay, amoxicillin I know is the active ingredient, but what else is in that capsule that I'm taking? And oh, by the way, if COVID-19 vaccine was administered in the form of a capsule, would I worry about what's in it? Most people don't. I'm sure maybe some do, but this is something that I think there's very, very few medications out there that has a single active ingredient and there's nothing else that's accomplishing. So just to sort of set the scale for what I'm going to talk about later on. Next slide. Now, let's talk about mRNA vaccines and what it does and what's the purpose of it. Uh, Vaccines, this mRNA vaccine is basically designed to elicit production of antibodies that block cell transmission or infection of COVID-19. And on the right-hand side, you can see this, what we talked about a little bit earlier, this RNA molecule, which basically is part of the normal process that goes on in human and living organisms. But what has happened is they have engineered now, and it's been engineered so that the mRNA that is naturally produced is now going to been designed so that it protects the body from being infected by the COVID vaccine. So it basically serves as a neutralizing, a blocking agent. So it basically blocks the entry of the COVID vaccine into human cells. And that's how basically, you know, these vaccines are designed. It basically is blocking the transmission or infection of the vaccine, the virus itself. Next slide. Okay, now, there's been a lot of questions out there about what's in it, what does it contain? Now, as you remember earlier, we talked about what's in basically amoxicillin. Well, if you think about what's in mRNA, and I know there's been a lot of questions about it and the vaccine itself, let's talk about what's not in there first, because I know that this has been a big question, a big issue in a lot of people's mind out there. There's no fetal cells in the vaccine. There's no pork products. There's no microchips to chase you around and figure out what you're doing, you know, when you at home and minding your own business and getting your big brothers watching over you. There's no mercury, there's no latex products, and there's no DNA altering products. These are some of the the 6 most common questions that I get and that people raise about what's in the mRNA vaccine. Next slide. Now, what is in it? Well, Moderna has their version and Pfizer has their version, but let's talk about each one of the two big ones out there in the market today. The Pfizer vaccine, which was one of the early ones that entered into the market, it contains what we call lipids. And the lipids is nothing but products that aid in the delivering of the mRNA into the cells to basically provide the neutralizing antibodies that basically protects you from entry of the COVID vaccine. In addition, there's some salts to help balance the acidity, and then some sugar products. Now, all these products on the right-hand side are products that have been used and previously approved for vaccines or a lot of other medications. So there's nothing that is unusual or new. The new product is the mRNA itself. And basically, because you can't deliver the mRNA as a molecule directly into you, you have to basically deliver it using the components on the right-hand side to maintain its structure, to maintain its stability, and to make sure it's stable once you inject it with the vaccine. Next slide. Forward, yeah. Now, Moderna. Moderna, if you look at it, it's pretty similar. There's really not much difference. It contains lipids, which basically, these are nanoparticles. I didn't mention it earlier, but these are nanoparticles that basically encapsulates the mRNA molecule itself and aids in delivery into the cells to avoid it from being degraded prior to it reaching the point of into the cell, so that it can do what it was put there to do, and that is provide the neutralizing antibodies that's going to protect you from infection. And then there's some other products based in a group that we call acids for stability, salts for stability, and sugars primarily for stability. So all of these products, as I said, have been out there. They've been approved for use in medical applications, for other vaccines, for other products. They've been tested. And so there's nothing really new in terms of what's being delivered into your in the vaccine itself. The only product, as I said, that's new is the mRNA. Okay, next slide. I think that's really it. In interest of time, I thank you for your attention, and hopefully you can all be safe out there. And thank you for letting me share what I've done with you. Okay.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Knight. And also thank you for sharing your personal experience with the vaccine. I should mention all of our presenters today, I believe, have had the vaccine, and so they'll be able to share their respective experiences. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Owen Garrick to talk to us a little bit about clinical trials. Dr. Garrick, over to you.
All right, thank you much. I assume everyone can hear me well, just fine. All right, so I'm going to talk about a few things, 3 things. I do not have slides, so you'll need to pay attention. There's going to be a quiz at the end, so it'll be an open book test, so feel free to take notes. I'm going to cover a little bit about the vaccine trial structure, the 3 studies or the 3 authorized vaccines in the US. The Pfizer one, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. There's another authorized vaccine globally, AstraZeneca, but it's not authorized in the US. I'll talk a little bit about what the results mean, in particular what we hear this 95%, 60% number or numbers, give you perspective of what those mean. And then also at the same time, talk about what it does not mean, or at least what is certainly still not known based on these vaccine trials, and wrap up by touching on variants, which is pretty common in the news. All right, makes sense? And feel free to ask some questions in the chat. And then I think there's some time for Q&A afterwards. And just by background, my first job in industry, I worked in Merck's vaccine division. So I'm a big believer in vaccines, and I just want to, say that so you can level set in terms of your response or reaction to my comments. As a company, we have not worked on any of the vaccine studies. We have advised on a COVID pneumonia study, and I'm also on the board of the New York Blood Center, and the New York Blood Center is fairly active in convalescent plasma treatment for COVID pneumonia and COVID infection. So just to disclose all of those affiliations, so as you listen to me, you'll have a perspective from where I am coming. And then a few terms that I will, at the end, hopefully depart to you in terms of understanding. A good sense of time-based versus event-based clinical trials. I've been very careful to use the word authorized when I talk about the vaccines that are in the news and available versus approved. So we'll get a sense of that distinction. And then finally, the term subgroup analysis. All right, so at the end of the day, at your next link meeting, you can drop some of these terms with some confidence and people will be impressed for the ones that aren't attending today. All right, so let's jump into the vaccine studies. Generally, when you have a clinical trial to get a drug approved, you have a negotiation. If you're a company or an individual or a nonprofit, you have a negotiation with the Food and Drug Administration as to how big the study will be in terms of number of people, what endpoints. An endpoint means what you're looking to evaluate. So very importantly, in the current vaccine trials, the endpoint of what was evaluated was the ability to reduce or prevent symptoms, not the ability of these vaccines to reduce or prevent infection. All right, so there's a distinction between using these vaccines to prevent myself from getting sick and using these vaccines to help me prevent others from getting sick. All right, so the vaccine trials were designed to look at preventing me as an individual from getting sick, not the fact that I can't transmit it to someone else. That's very important, I think, to think through or to keep in mind. The studies were also what I call event-based versus time-based. Most clinical trials are time-based, so you have, especially vaccines, some amount of time, usually years versus months in terms of evaluating and studying what happened. So usually you get a vaccine or a trial, you're in a trial, you get a shot. Some people get the actual vaccine, some people get a placebo, so not the actual active vaccine, and you go about your daily lives for a number of years. You go to baseball games, football games, you're on trains and planes, you're on the BART train here in the Bay Area, get coughing on people, sneezing on people, everything, carrying on, you're interacting with your kids, they're in and out of daycare, school, etc. And keep in mind, we're not acting, most of us, certainly in California, certain states are doing it a little differently, but here in California, for the most part, we wear masks, we're encouraged to stay home, we're not on BART, we're not in offices. So how we're going about our daily lives now is a lot different than typical, right? And I want to mention that, so as we think about these results, right, and we hear these numbers of 95%, 60% efficacious, very technically efficacious from, in terms of preventing symptoms, those symptoms are, and catching the virus is a reflection of how we're acting now. So what will very likely happen as restrictions are eased and we're back at work, we're back on BART, the NCAA March Madness is happening, we're in crowded or relatively crowded stadiums, we'll begin to see in a real world sense how truly effective these vaccines are. All right, so in terms of event, so that's usually time-based, but these vaccines were event-based. So the events, really, you looked at the number of events that happened, right? Irrespective of how long it took. And in this case, for most of all the vaccine studies, the FDA required at least, I think it was 50 to 100 individuals who got infected. And they defined that as those that showed symptoms and they were confirmed by, you hear this term PCR, polymerase chain reaction. So they had symptoms of COVID and they had a test to show that they in fact had the virus. Right, so that's and as you know, there are a lot of people that are asymptomatic, right? So they were not captured in the normal course of this study, right? So when we get to this number of, and so 50 or 100 is not a big number when you realize and know that, these studies, in the Pfizer case, there are about 40,000 people involved. In the Moderna case, there are about 30,000 patients. And in Johnson & Johnson, the most recently authorized, there are 44,000. J&J or Johnson & Johnson was a little different, and that was more of a global study. So they had a lot of data from outside the US, whereas the Pfizer and Moderna studies had more data as a percentage from within the US. And in terms of number of Blacks people, so in terms of the overall minority number, ethnic minority number, those were in that 30% range. In terms of the number of Black people that participated in the study, in Pfizer it was 10% roughly, in Moderna it was 10%, and in Johnson & Johnson it was actually at 17.2%. So the real question is, does that mean anything to me? What does that mean to me? And the other thing you have to keep in mind, the way data is collected, this term Black in the J&J case, it's a global study, and they had about 6,000 of their 44,000 people participating from South Africa. So Black Africans were likely counted in that number Black, just like Black Americans would be, Black Brazilians, Black people in Canada, et cetera. Right? And so there's probably a difference, or there may be a difference between how me as a Black American respond and react to a vaccine and the virus compared to people from other countries. So keep that in mind. So that's probably is the big reason that the J&J numbers are larger than the rest of, compared to Pfizer and Moderna. But generally, so the question is, well, does that matter? And then we get to that second term, subgroup analysis, right? So you need enough numbers to see if there are real differences between the Black people that participated and the non-Black people, everyone else, right? So generally, these studies showed some decent efficaciousness, right? The target for being authorized by the Food and Drug Administration was 50%, 50. So if your vaccine that was studied had a better than 50% number, you were more than likely to get authorized, right? So all three of the vaccines, J&J, Moderna, and Pfizer, were above that number. Now, and I use the term efficacious versus effective. Once again, effective means it's a real world setting, right? I get the vaccine, I go out my daily life like I did 2 years ago, interacting with people. We're not doing this, having this conversation on Zoom. We're in a nice restaurant because the links, of course, they're going to have something nice, upscale. It's going to be very well done. Not that Zoom is not well done, but we're interacting with each other, right? That is the term effectiveness. Efficacious is very much a technical term in the confines of this clinical trial and how it was designed, and the fact that people are mainly staying at home. How many people actually got infected? Actually, very technically, how many people who got infected showed symptoms and also had this positive PCR test, right? And that number, if you look at Pfizer's number, Pfizer's that 95% number we hear, of their 40,000 people, the 170 of that 40,000 had met those two criteria within the time frame that they were being studied. So, and 8 of those 170 were in the vaccine arm, i.e. they actually got the actual vaccine, and the rest, 163, were in the placebo arm, so they didn't actually get the vaccine. So much larger number in terms of those that were in the vaccine or the placebo arm that got infected and had a positive, had symptoms and had a positive PCR test. So if you divide 8 by 170, you come to 4.7%, carry to 1, multiply by 100, right? You subtract that from 100, right? That gets to you 95%. So that's how we come up with that 95% number. Now, what it doesn't mean, or what it may not mean, I should say, is that as we go to Disneyland and hang out and go to our chapter meetings and have dinners together outside of pods, right? Will those numbers hold? That is to be determined, right? So that's the disadvantage of having an event-based clinical trial versus a time-based clinical trial. These are things that you don't quite know yet. The other things you don't quite know, and Dr. Kendrick will talk about this, is the fact that women who were pregnant were not in these clinical trials, and also, but certainly largely, I'm sure, probably, there are probably a couple of women that actually found out they were pregnant of the 40,000 or so. But generally, these studies were not for women that were women that were excluded who may be pregnant, and then very young kids. So we don't know, there's limited data, or at least in these vaccine studies that we're talking about, there's limited data in terms of the vaccine efficaciousness or effectiveness for those groups. So those are unknowns. And there are currently ongoing studies to look at whether or not these, once again, subgroups, these groups actually benefit from the vaccine just like everyone else. Now, very quickly talk about authorized versus approved. These drugs or vaccines are authorized. It's very technical, right? So there's legislation that allows within a, if we're in a public health emergency, which we are, and there are limited options of other treatment, which there in fact are limited options for COVID treatment. You can go through a less rigorous approval process not a less approval process to get your compound or drug authorized for use in the general population. You would then keep through the longer term process to get full approval. All right, so these vaccines have been authorized, and I'm pretty sure it'd be very odd if they were still not going through that regular approval process. All right, so the fact that we are a year ago, we had our backs against the wall, right? People were dying left and right. We had no clear sense of how bad this pandemic is going to be, how long it was going to last. And so if you ask me, and this is my subjective perspective, right? How the vaccine trials were designed, very, very reasonable. Very, very reasonable. You can argue that, yeah, they should have looked at asymptomatic individuals as well, tested everyone to see exactly the percentages. That makes sense. But we just did not have that amount of time. So those are just my general thoughts. I will close with this term variant. I won't get into the technical definition of what a variant is, but the most important thing for the virus and the vaccine is the behavior of the virus different, in terms of these variants. You hear about the British one, the South African one. I'm sure there are different ones throughout the US. Does the virus behave differently? And very importantly, right, does it either infect more people or does it cause people to get more sick? Those are the really important things. And so those are, as we think through different variants, those are the things that we should consider. So I'll give you a non-medical example, right? I'm here presenting to you. I'm pretty casual. I have a sweater on. Before this talk, I just did a run, right? And I could have stayed in my sweatsuit, my running sneakers, and all of that. I probably would not have been invited back to any Lynx event ever again. And you may have responded to what I say differently, but I'm the same person. The fact that I have a different outfit on is technically a variation, right? But my behavior in terms of, the ability to communicate information isn't different. Your response to that information might be different. And certainly me going on a run, I probably need, it's probably better to have sneakers on versus shoes. But those are, me as an individual, I do not change dramatically based on what I am wearing. But in the case of viruses, right, these slight differences might in fact cause the virus to behave differently. And very importantly for us, it is, once again, does it infect more people? And two, do the people that get infected get sicker? All right, so those are the things to think about when you hear this term variant. And I will pause there, and I'll be back during the Q&A. Appreciate your time.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Garrick. And one other quick question: you've had the vaccine. Any experiences you want to share with the group?
So I have not had the vaccine. I am way down the line in terms of eligibility. So I'll be probably last.
Got it.
In line.
Got it. Perfect. And now we'll move over to Mr. Ken West. He's going to talk to us a little bit about vaccine administration here in Northern California and give us a sense of what's happening here in our state and locally in the Bay. So Mr. West, over to you.
All right, thank you. And I really appreciate the Peninsula Bay Lynx inviting me to come and speak with you. And I wanted to just take a few brief moments to share some thoughts and give you a sense of what the current state is as it relates to both delivery and administration of vaccines across the state, and probably more specific to the communities in which we live here in the Bay Area. So I will say that I have been fortunate enough as a healthcare worker to receive the vaccine as well. I got the Pfizer vaccine on, I think that was December 23rd, so just before Christmas. And about a month later, got my second dose of that. And I really just experienced kind of extreme tiredness and grogginess the first evening, and just a little bit of kind of achiness and joint pain the next day. That was moderated by a little ibuprofen and back to normal. So I hope that by us sharing our experiences, it will also encourage others, if it's currently your turn or when it's your turn, to also consider as well. So next slide. So first, I wanted to just give a sense of, in the state of California in total, we have received about 12 million doses of the vaccine across the state. And about 77% or a little over 9 million of those have been put in people's arms all across the state. If you'll look in our areas, Santa Clara County, where I'm specifically located, we've gotten about 500,000 doses administered. But you'll see all throughout the rest of the area how that actually breaks out, with Los Angeles County, which is the largest in all of the state, receiving the largest allocation of that as well. And it's important to note that we're now trending around 80% of the doses that have been delivered being administered. Early on in the early phases of vaccine administrations, most people were required to hold back second doses for everyone who got a first dose. So you would oftentimes hear these reports in the media, both nationally and in the state and locally, that people were only administering roughly 50% of the doses that they were given. And part of that was because we were very unsure of the actual supply chain of when the next shipment of those doses would be delivered. And so there was great hesitancy around should we give them up front. But now that's been really loosened, and the guidance from the state and the local counties has been a shot is a shot. So you give every dose that you have on hand, with the expectation that you will be getting future allotments to ensure that people can get those second doses. It's a little tricky, and oftentimes it creates some anxiety out in the community. But ultimately, as we've seen from the feds, they've made a pretty strong commitment that by the end of May, they believe that every adult in the US who wants to get a vaccine will ultimately have access to receive that as well. So next slide, please. So I wanted to also, more importantly, dive into, at this point, who's actually getting the vaccine, and specifically by race. From an age perspective, I think in our state, and I've even seen in our local county, we're getting into the majority of individuals who are 65 and older have actually gotten vaccinated. But when we look in areas as it relates to race, you can see here in the state of California, we're at 2.9 of those individuals who identify as Black or African American. Now there may be in unknown or multi-race, but just generally speaking, we at a much lower rate are receiving vaccines compared to our counterparts. And more specifically in the Bay Area, I don't think we've really done much better. You look at Santa Clara, San Mateo County, even in Alameda, which is where Oakland is housed, you would think we would perhaps have a larger rate compared to places like Santa Clara, which is only about 3% African American in total, but still fairly low. And so this tells us that we still have a lot of work to do on, as we're doing here today, dispelling myths, educating our communities, and helping people have be equipped with the information to make an educated decision that's very personal to them and their respective families as well. So, and why this is very important is if you look at who's being disproportionately impacted by the virus, we've seen lots of data related to the case rates, but specifically when we look at the lethality of the virus, the death rate in African Americans is about 7% higher than the state. And when we look at the Latino community, it's actually 21% higher than the state average for death rates. And then if you look even further into socioeconomic, so those households who have a median income of less than 40,000, they actually are 38% higher rate of death from COVID-19. And so this tells us, and we can see that oftentimes in more diverse communities, they oftentimes may have a lower socioeconomics, and so it's disproportionately impacting those who are in poorer communities and those who are in Black and brown communities. And so it's incumbent upon us to ensure that we as health professionals can make sure that we have information out to those individuals also. Next slide, please. So the most important part is how do you get the vaccine? Who's eligible for it? When and where can you go to get vaccinated? So first off, there's been a lot of controversy, not only here in California, but states around the country, around how it was determined and who should go and when. The CDC actually publishes the guidelines, and both the states, the counties, and local municipalities are implored to follow those guidelines. And so we started with healthcare workers and individuals who were in long-term care residencies. First, that was estimated to be around 3 million people, and then later expanded to everyone who was over the age of 65. And those who worked in what we call essential workers, whether it's in emergency services, education and childcare, and agriculture and food. That consists of roughly 12 million people as well. Here in about a week or so, there is guidance that now individuals who are at risk or suffer from other illnesses will be eligible to receive their vaccines. I won't read them to you, but you can see here cancer, chronic kidney disease, amongst many others, are the ones that will individuals who will be available to have access to the vaccines here soon. And as you've heard, a lot of reports around states and counties are very interested in getting their schools back open, getting their students back into the schools. And so it's going to be important that teachers, administrators, and other employees who work in the schools are going to be able to have access to those vaccines so that we can safely and efficiently reopen our schools to ensure that our students and children aren't going to be in harm's way. I think most important is knowing where you can go to find out. So many of you all have probably heard through, whether you've been eligible yourself or someone has kind of told you. I'd first say start with your respective county websites. So whether you're in San Mateo, Santa Clara County, look for that. And there's still locations that are designated either by private organizations like mine, who we've done nearly 6,000 vaccines that we've given out, or the county, which has its own designated sites like the fairgrounds here in Santa Clara County. But then as well, most recently, Blue Cross California, Blue Shield California has been in negotiations with the state of California. And I think everything is wrapped up at this point, but they will be serving as the third-party administrator to provide vaccines on the state level across all of the counties across California. You can go to the website that they have. It's called myturn.ca.gov. There's also a toll-free number as well that you can dial if you are somewhat challenged for computers to be able to identify where you can go and get your vaccines, how to sign up for those as well. In addition, there's some other pop-up sites you may hear about, like Levi Stadium. Those are typically outside of the state and outside of the counties as sort of a private site. Anywhere that you can get access to the vaccine, I encourage. There's no one specific or special place to go to. They all have the same vaccines, or maybe in some different iterations, but most have either had Moderna or Pfizer at this point. And I suspect here pretty soon is the beginning to ramp up production of J&J. There will be locations, whether it be private pharmacies like your CVS and Walgreens, or to other mass vaccination sites that will be available. So next slide. And I think with that, I'll end and hand it over to Dr. Kendrick.
That's perfect. Thank you, Mr. West. Dr. Kendrick, over to you, specifically COVID-19 and the impact on women, as well as for those who are pregnant or maybe thinking about becoming pregnant.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Next slide. So in terms of pregnancy, as we all know, pregnancy is supposed to be the most, one of the happiest times in one's life. And in 2022 and 2021, being pregnant in the presence of COVID-19 pandemic was really quite challenging. And during that time, you had to decide what to do, how to go forward with getting pregnant, being pregnant during a pandemic, and actually also delivering during a pandemic. And to just give you an idea, I would say I do all my deliveries at Good Samaritan, and in November, December, because of the pandemic, and historically, as people, when we've been shut indoors, the pregnancy rate goes up. Well, so I got a call from my physician rep, excuse me, for Good Sam, because they wanted to be prepared for January, December, because that was 9 months from the beginning of the shutdown in California when we're all home as of about March 17th. Some companies were home as of February, but in terms of just overall lockdown. And so I actually hadn't really looked at my numbers. And of course, all of us expect the numbers to be huge. And in fact, my numbers were really low. I had probably in all of my career never had 6 deliveries slated for both January, February. Now the numbers are going up, but it was interesting to show that people really just instinctively just decided they didn't understand what was going on, and they actually they decided not to get pregnant. Next slide. So pregnant women, just so you're aware, pregnant women are at increased risk for severe illness from COVID-19 and death compared to non-pregnant women. There's an increased risk of also premature births if you do become infected. And the reason for that is that pregnant women are just significantly higher risk because for the severe outcome based on even compared to non-pregnant, because some of the changes that occur physiologically in a female's body when they're pregnant. Next slide. Now, just to give you some numbers, and these numbers I got, and they're updated up to March 2nd of 2021. And the CDC has areas that they collect data from throughout the United States. And in the areas that they collected data from, they had, in terms of severity of cases, they had the total number of cases of 73,617, with 80 of those, unfortunately, that succumbed to the disease during pregnancy. Next slide. Women that were hospitalized during that same range who happened to be pregnant was 12,000, let's say 500. Next slide. Of those women, the infants that were born to these women, they had 8,000 that went to full term, and 1,100 that were born prematurely. Next slide. Now, one of the things that were done, and if you notice, the numbers are pretty small because the data that they're collecting, it's hard to get all of this data. And so unfortunately, the number that I'm showing you right now that they have up until February 10th was only available for about 1,500 of the infants that were born. 60 of them tested positive, 1,400 tested negative. And the protocol was that when, as a child, you're born to a mother that is COVID positive, symptomatic or not, that the baby was tested at 24 hours for COVID, and they were tested again at 48 hours. They had another COVID screen at 48 hours. And so, but I just wanted you to be aware that these numbers are probably small because of the amount of data. The data that I also couldn't find anywhere, and I even called Good Samaritan Hospital to see if they had any data. I called the NICU. And to date, at least at Good Samaritan, and I know it's a small environment, but they had not had any babies that actually succumbed to COVID. Now they could get very sick, but so far that there was no at least fetal death, at least within my small community of Good Samaritan Hospital. Next slide. Now, we're a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, there's a lot of stuff that we don't know, and there's a lot of stuff that we're still learning. But COVID-19 is uncommon in newborns that are born to mothers, as you can see from the test, who contracted COVID-19 during pregnancy. Some of them tested positive, and we don't know where they contracted the disease. Was it during pregnancy, before, during delivery, and then after they delivered? We're not sure. The data scarce is still coming. Most of the newborns who tested positive, they usually had mild or no symptoms. Of course, there have been a few reported cases of newborns that were severely affected by having a COVID-19 virus infection. Next slide. Now, say you are pregnant, you delivered, you are now in the hospital and you're positive. The thing is that mom has to take precaution once they're delivered. So I'll give you an example. I have a patient that was COVID positive and symptomatic. Her husband was also COVID positive and symptomatic, so he could not come to the hospital at all. She required a C-section, and the preparation and everything that we had to do in order to get her delivered so that we were also safe and also that the baby was safe was quite a production. We got it done, and we were able, thank goodness we all have cell phones, that we were able to at least call him in, through the phone, that he could participate. But it was unfortunate that he had to be away while her sister, who was known to be COVID negative, we tested her before we had her come into the operating room with us. So that being said, once you're delivered as a COVID positive mother, everyone is they're in a negative pressure room, meaning that everything is stayed sealed within that room. It doesn't get communicated throughout the hospital. Mom has to wear a mask and wash hands. And really the mom needs to stay they try to stay away 6 feet away from the newborn unless while nursing. When they're nursing, they do have to wear a mask because of the transmission. Some hospitals keep the baby in an isolette, which is, I don't know if you've seen those shows where the baby's in almost like an incubator where you have areas for your hand. That keeps the baby warm. It keeps them protected from the virus, when they're just in the room. If a partner is positive for COVID, then someone else has to be in the hospital as a support person for the mom. That partner cannot be in the hospital because it's also hard to take care, be mindful and cautious with 2 people that are now positive in a room while medical staff is coming in and out. So it does get quite complicated. And in the hospital and in California, especially at Good Sam, we've never had dads not be able to come in, but that is the only person that has been in. We loosened things up and doulas were able to come in. That's another kind of labor coach. That went away. And so right now we are just with a partner, one person, and that's it. Next slide. Once the isolation period is over, you still, of course, want to make sure that you're washing your hands when you're taking care of the newborn, so that you just don't pass the virus to the baby. If you're symptomatic, isolation period ends when you're 10 days post-symptoms, and of course, 24 hours where you've not had any fevers or you're not taking any meds to contain a fever or any other symptoms are associated, with cough and all of that. As your symptoms are improving, If you've never had symptoms, then it's the 10 days post your positive COVID test. Next slide. Now, for us as OBGYNs, and I think there was a question in the chat that the COVID vaccine is not all of them. The Pfizer, Moderna, and but let's talk about the Pfizer, Moderna. They are, you're not getting a live vaccine with those. And so for us in OBGYN, the point of it is you cannot get a live activated vaccine. So for us, the mRNA vaccines do not cause, they're not live. And so based on that, we're able to advise our patients to get the vaccine. The mRNA vaccine does not cause any genetic changes in the fetus. Because remember, these vaccines, you're just getting the mRNA. It's a small piece of instruction that gets into your cells to have your cells, your immune system, create antibodies that will then see any virus that it may get and make sure that it deals with it. So in terms of that, there's of course, all of this is conjecture for us, right? Because as Dr. Garrett said, we don't study pregnant women. There has never been a study that's ever done where we actually actively enroll pregnant women. But there's one of the things that Pfizer and Moderna did is that they made sure that there's a way of getting information if you're pregnant, that gets sent into them. So they're amassing all of this data. But if you think about the way the vaccines are created and what they do, it makes sense that you can administer that to someone who's pregnant or even breastfeeding and not have any adverse effect. But then again, this is correct. It is this. So we think the expected safety profile, when we look at what was studied, that pregnant women should not be excluded from getting the vaccine. Next slide. So here it is in a nutshell, the ACOG, which is the governing body for an OBGYN, they recommend COVID-19 vaccines should not be withheld from pregnant women, and then also even if you're lactating. Now, as of March 15th, pregnant women are now in the tier that you're eligible to get the COVID-19 vaccine. And I definitely have been telling each and every one of my patients, I know it's a choice, but I do advocate and tell them that I would love for them to consider getting the COVID-19 vaccine. Next question. Slide, sorry. So this is I actually did get the COVID-19 vaccine on December 20th. As soon as the email came up from Good Sam, I went on, I made my appointment that day and I went in and got it. Maybe about 24 hours, maybe a little bit less. I had a sore arm, it was a little, not as bad as say a tetanus shot, but it was, it was sore. I couldn't get it all over my head. And then my second shot, about 26 hours after my my vaccination, I looked at my staff. It was about 5:30, and I'm like, if anyone does not have an emergency that they really need to speak to me, I need to go home, because I was profoundly, and that's the word I used to my husband when he asked me. I said, I am profoundly fatigued. And usually I'm someone that I don't go to bed till about 1 o'clock. And I was in bed at 8 o'clock, but I had, quite frankly, the best sleep of my life. And I jokingly said to someone, can I get a third shot? Because that was just an amazing sleep. I never got up once. I was so, I slept so well. So, but I also said to myself, that fatigue, and so I was hooraying my body for doing what it needed to do, because that's a side effect, right? That my body is really hard at work, stimulating, getting my antibodies all revved up so that if I am exposed, hopefully when I'm, if I am exposed, that my symptoms would be mild, I won't be hospitalized, and I won't end up in an ICU on a ventilator. Next slide. All right. Action plan, make sure you learn more, talk to others, listen to others' experience, but also remember, guys, that those side effects, the fever, the sore arm, the chills, the fatigue, the headache, that is your body's response that is creating antibodies. I really want you to change your perspective of looking at that as something positive as opposed to something negative. Okay, visit your county, the COVID website, wear a mask, wash your hands often. Please keep doing that. Even if you get the vaccine, you still have to wear your mask, you still wash your hands, and just make sure you just reach out to people and let them know what you've learned. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kendrick. And thank you to all of our speakers. Now we're moving to the Q&A portion of our programming. So I know there are a number of questions that have come in through the chat. I'll also be passing it over to Link Angela Alton, who has also compiled some questions as well. So Link Angela, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the questions that we received through the registration for today's event. And the first question is, what are the differences between the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine? Is one better than the other? Should we wait for the new Johnson & Johnson single dose vaccine? And what are the differences between the 3 vaccines available?
Yeah, I can take, this is Owen Garrick. I'll take a cut at that. Moderna and Pfizer, no big differences, right? One, they're both mRNA vaccines. One has a little bit more product than the other. And one you take they're advising you to take within 3 weeks, one versus, 4 weeks. Relatively the same results, same percentage of Black folks. No big difference. Now, from a patient perspective, from a delivery system perspective, Ken can probably comment on that. There are differences in terms of dry ice and those headaches and stuff like that. From a patient, from a biology perspective, no big difference. J&J is a DNA vaccine, and they use a weakened virus, so a different mechanism. The results are a little different, right? But also J&J's results are more global results, as I commented on. And it's 1 shot versus 2, right? They're having some follow-on studies, I believe, to see if, a second dose actually bumps their efficaciousness up comparable to the Pfizer and Moderna ones. So different mechanism. The data suggests that the J&J vaccine is better at preventing very severe illness, right? But once, there's also a question in chat. There's no or limited data right now in terms of any of these vaccines being effective in terms of transmission, right? So there's a difference between me getting sick and me getting others sick. They may in fact be effective. We just have not studied that. And just so you know, the mRNA and DNA virus vaccines, or vaccines rather, these are the first 2 in these class that were authorized. So before these 3 vaccines, we as a scientific research community had not produced effective vaccines for in these categories. So these are all both fairly new in terms of, the science is not new. Let me be clear about that. The science is not new. But in terms of them being available on the market, they are the first in both of their respective classes. Hopefully that's responsive to the question. I'll defer to Ken for the.
Yeah, and just to add what Owen said, particularly with Pfizer, it requires something that's called ultra cold storage. And so these are these sub-zero, really, really cold freezers that it has to be stored in. And as Jim mentioned, some of these other additives, whether there's sugars and salts, those are things that help keep it stable when it's in that environment. And so once you thaw them, you have a certain period of time in which you have to give them out. And so you can imagine for your rank and file, let's say pharmacies or physician offices or clinics, most people don't have that type of cold storage on site. It's very expensive to get as well, which is why you don't see very many people, and I suspect you won't in terms of Pfizer. And so that's somewhat more of a competitive advantage of Moderna to Pfizer. There's also, in terms of Pfizer, there are officially 5 doses in the vial. Depending on the type of syringe that you have, you can actually get a 6th dose out of that. And for Moderna, there are 10 doses in that vial, and you can get an 11th out of it depending on the syringe that you have. So those are really just some of the subtlety nuances, which is really just affects how you manage respective clinics on the flow. And particularly, you see these things that happen. It's kind of a wild goose chase at the end of a clinic where you have 2 or 3 people come in, they're due for their vaccine. Well, now you've popped a new vial. You got 7 or 8 doses you have to kind of get rid of. So you're calling people up who are on tomorrow's list, people on the wait list, scrambling, trying to find people. We did very similar things where we were calling fire and EMS and police officers to make sure we can get those doses given out. Because the last thing you want to do is waste the dose because of just how precious it is at this point.
Thank you. I'm going to go to another question from our pre-submitted questions. Should mammograms be scheduled before or after the COVID-19 vaccine?
I mean, for us, I think of mammograms, especially if you're someone that, say you found something that's symptomatic, I think you need to go in regardless. Now, if you're just going in for a screening mammogram and, depending on where you are in the tier, I've been telling my patients, it really doesn't matter. These mammogram places, your appointments are spaced out. They're sanitizing the rooms. I mean, they have HEPA filters. They're doing everything. So my suggestion to everyone is don't delay your care. You really should go in for your appointments. Now, if you're ill and you're having symptoms, then my suggestion is to make sure that you get evaluated, because you do not want to go in yourself and cause harm to anyone. But our suggestion is get your scheduled testing done. Do not delay if you have, because one of the surgeons during the height of COVID, she had 4 patients that did not come in when they really, really needed to. And she's making some hard decisions to what she has to do for these patients. So please go in for all of your scheduled appointments when they're supposed to be done.
Thank you. Another question is, I have family members and or friends who have already gotten sick due to COVID-19. Do they still need to get the vaccine? Since they've already been sick, are 2 doses of the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine required, or will one suffice? And follow-up question is, after you've had COVID-19, how long are you contagious?
So the recommendation is that, or the guidance from the CDC, they don't distinguish between those that have been infected versus not. There's no difference in terms of the recommendation. So if you're in the identified class, you should get, they're recommending you get the vaccine, irrespective of whether or not you, your loved one, your cousin, your brother, whoever may or may not have been sick. So no difference there. What was the other part of the question?
If you've been sick already, would 1 dose be fine as opposed to having 2?
So no data on that very specific question. And once again, the guidance is do the recommendations from the vaccine manufacturer. So COVID, Moderna and Pfizer, 2 doses, you should get those 2 doses. J&J, 1 dose, you should get that 1 dose.
Yeah, and typically what happens around, some period of delay post being infected with COVID is because the only reason that's generally recommended, number one, if you don't want to come sick and infected to a vaccination site and infect everyone else. But number 2, your body has already produced some level of immune response already, and so you probably have antibodies that have been that are in your body. And so, and at some point they will probably subside, I suspect. But that's really what we've heard in terms of why you don't need it most immediately post having COVID. In terms of prioritizing those individuals who don't have those antibodies yet, getting their vaccines before. But we have a lot of people say, "Hey, I've gotten COVID. I don't need to get the vaccine." Well, you can get it again. So we certainly encourage you, if that's the choice you want to make, to go and get the vaccine.
Okay. Question, are there any ingredients in the vaccine similar to those in ACE inhibitors?
Yeah, I can take a quick stab at this if you want me to. I put a slide up earlier depicting the components that are in the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. But for example, mRNA is the active ingredient, and mRNA is basically a molecule. It's a let's say call it a molecule that is in every living cell, human, virus, or whatever. It's always there. So basically, the mRNA is not a foreign substance when it gets inside of your body or when it gets inside of your cell. So it doesn't elicit the same response that a totally foreign substance that your body's never seen before when it gets inside of you. So in that respect, I don't think that mRNA vaccines per se is something that people should be afraid of, because it's something that your immune system has never ever seen or never ever had any contact with before. It's just a different variation, a different synthesis of the molecule, but it's not mRNA the same as the DNA, which is already inside of your body. So I don't think it's something that really you need to worry too much about. It's how you're going to respond to it.
And just one thing to add, and I've heard this a few times, and I think where it comes from. So ACE inhibitor, ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. And angiotensin, angio blood tensin pressure. So that's something that regulates blood pressure. That's why it's used in blood pressure and heart disease. The ACE receptor, which is the target for the virus, and also the target for the drug, the ACE inhibitor. So same targets, right? So that's probably where it's coming from. Now the ACE receptor is all over our body, in our lungs, which is why you have a lot of lung issues, in the arteries, in the heart, in the kidney, in the intestines. That's why you hear a lot of GI things. So I think that's where it might be coming from. So, but the virus, the spike protein, attaches to that ACE receptor on the surface of our cells. And that is very similar to this. Well, it's connected or related to the drug, but the very specific question is, other than maybe some minor ingredients in formulation, there's no similarity.
All right, thank you. Another question is, will a booster vaccination be developed to address the new variants that have emerged?
We hope.
I think they are looking at developing some vaccines for the variants. I know Pfizer was looking at some stuff, and what they're thinking is that kind of where we are right now, that they will not have to go through the rigorous testing to get it on the market. So that's the last thing that I've kind of seen, is that they find that they're definitely looking at that to see if they can get that done quicker.
And if I could just add one thing, today as we speak, there are groups around the world, and I've been watching some of the chat rooms they all understand now that the virus itself, in order for it to survive, it's got to produce variants. Otherwise, your body will figure out a way to eliminate it. And it doesn't want to be eliminated. That's the survival of the fittest, so to speak. So now what is going on is there's reverse engineering going on in the world. that is now trying to figure out, okay, what's the next variation that this virus is likely to produce to evade detection and elimination. So now they are jumping ahead and starting to say, okay, what should this vaccine that we have developed today, what should we put in it, or what ingredient, or what changes in the mRNA structure that we need to make to basically anticipate what variants the virus is going to produce in 3, 4, 5, or 6 months down the road, or even a week down the road. So that's already going on. And most of the companies out there, I know Moderna and Pfizer and all the others are now sitting around today saying that what tweaks do we have to make in, say, the second or third iteration of the vaccine to make it more effective. So that's an ongoing process that will be with us until we eliminate the COVID-19 itself.
Thank you. We have been overwhelmed with quite a few questions, and I only have time for one additional question, but we do have notes of your questions, and we will be able to get responses back to everyone. The question that I wanted to finish up with is, I have family members who are skeptical of getting the vaccine based on how Black people have been unknowingly used as medical experiments throughout history. What can I say to my family members? How do we best convince our community to get the vaccine?
I'm happy to start. This is how we go about, and I personally go about talking to folks about participation in clinical research. I'm open and honest about the historical abuses. I don't hide them. I don't sugarcoat them. And I also think it's important to know that it's not just something that happened 50 years ago, but people of color face issues in the healthcare system every single day, every single week, next month, right? So these insults are going to continue to happen. I think to the degree that you have more information, and the other thing I find out there that people of color, Black people in particular, we're sponges for information, right? But that information has to be presented in a digestible way. And when we get information from a trusted source, we make very reasonable and rational decisions. That's generally my approach, but I'm always honest about the bad stuff that has happened to us. I think we do a disservice by trying to sugarcoat that stuff.
Yeah, I would echo the same points as Owen as well. I would also, what I would add to that as well is oftentimes look around to assess kind of the demand and who's getting it, right? So you hear these reports of, people paying sums of money to jump the line and all these other sorts of things. And so that would kind of, make you even ask the question or if people are going through such great lengths to skip the line for everyone else, can it in fact be something that's potentially designed for harm? Now it could be, but that's just another data point I would also kind of recommend to folks. And then what I would say, and I unfortunately have the purview of looking at many of the people who are being impacted by the virus. And unfortunately, when you work in hospitals, it's kind of a place where you see life and death, kind of the circle of life every day, all day within those four walls. And you're seeing the real life impacts of people who either either live in multi-generational households, B, don't have the benefits like we do, where we can sit in the comforts of our own home, socially distance, and go to work on Zoom and other, media like this, and they have to work shoulder to shoulder with people to still make a living for their families. Or C, lack of information and really understanding the appropriate ways to protect yourself and being able to have access to information like this. And so I can remember early on at the very start of COVID, having this conversation with both my wife and someone else of these videos that kind of pass around on social media saying that Black people couldn't get COVID and that there was, some sort of conspiracy. And you literally see the number of countless people that we've seen in our community who are not here today, who could have been here, had they had the right information in hand and are able to get access to a life-saving vaccine at this point. And so that's what I think about when I see the people who didn't have to leave this earth, who are who could have gotten the vaccine, but listened to someone else and got false information, and they're not with us today. So that's kind of how I think about it.
The other thing too, I think, was someone asking that question. I know the links are going to publish this on their website, I think. So, you have access to this information. Share this with friends, send it to all your relatives. We have to come from a place of power, and knowledge gives you that power. And one of the things I think we have to be very cautious with is, the YouTube. I mean, there's no way of figuring out if someone who does YouTube really understands what's going on. There's no verification of information. And so I would definitely want some like something like this that you have that is recorded, that you can pass around and see if that will help to get your family members more informed.
And just one last pinpoint here. I showed you in my earlier slide that basically the Moderna, which is one of the leading vaccines out there right now, the lady who was basically the leading scientist on developing that vaccine was a Black woman. And I just want to close by saying, okay, what else could she have done to convince the people out there on the sidelines? Okay, she could have been a minister. She could have been an ordained minister. Would that help? Or she could have been an ordained minister who played classical music. Would that help? So I just want to, when you talk to people about it, this is not something that's excluded the Black people from being out there in the forefront of developing the science and technology. And I don't know whether or not there's a way to get this out there in front of people, but there's a lot of scientific publications out there right now by Black scientists who verify that they have been involved in the development and the processing of this information and data and the vaccines. We were not left out of this process. Don't let anybody ever convince you that we were.
And weren't the clinical trials also done, some of them at Howard University?
They were done at Howard, and I believe some was done, at Morehouse also, yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Again, as Link Angela mentioned, we have reached the end of our program, but really want to give just huge thank you and just really very much appreciate to Mr. Jim Knight, Dr. Owen Garrick, Mr. Ken West, and Dr. Nerese Kendrick. As Dr. Nerese mentioned, the recording of this webinar will be posted on the PB Links website, so please do check that out, and also check out the website for more forthcoming webinars as well. We will definitely circle back on the questions that we weren't able to answer, and with that, I'll just say hope everyone continues to stay safe and healthy, and please continue to wear your masks. So on behalf of the Peninsula Bay chapter of the Links, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you again to our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.